Extras.
As several people noted, black sand is one of many, many exotic terrain features listed in the Sandstorm campaign setting book. I've never used Sandstorm as a setting, I haven't been excited by their lore, and I prefer making my own anyway, but that book has a few interesting game mechanics, spells and such, and lots of interesting ideas, especially in terms of fantastic environment and travel hazards. So, I don't use their setting, but I check the book all the time for things to borrow. Black sand? Negative energy damage? Check. But, as I mentioned, through Mora, Angel's follower and all-around aquatic exposition machine, the tales say black sand in our world supposedly arises at sites of great tragedy. I mean, obviously not every tragedy, but it likely requires some kind of tragedy or horrible event as an impetus in order to form whatever. We know this particular black sand had some kind of structure. It looked like a wooden frame protruding from its surface, and Reginald Black was like, "Black sand does not concern me. I want that thing, not excuses," and just walked across like its life-draining, skeleton-spawning power was nothing. As we saw, they got nothing out of it at the time. It's a bad place. Eventually, later on, they did learn what it is. I don't remember how, possibly out of character, but I think it was through research. In any case, it has so little to do with anything they're going to do that it's not really a spoiler when I tell you, long, long ago, when even the gods were new to the world, Ioun discovered the source of all magic in the astral sea. I've told the very brief mythological story a couple times. Vecna, evil god of secrets and creator of the undead, learned of Ioun's find, but rather than chase after it right away, he took his time, gathering all the knowledge and power he could before venturing into the astral depths, in hopes of wresting this immense power from his rival. As each god has a sanctum in the world, Vecna had a base of operations, into which rare items and secrets and other information in every form flowed like invisible streams from all across the world, whispered through the air or through the astral plane, delivered by things that flew or slithered or crawled from distant caves and hidden places, all guided by Vecna's promises, threats, guided by his divine will, and converging upon this little hut hidden in a swamp on land which would one day become the orcish homeland of Uruk. Not a fortress, no massive bastion, no palace or mansion or diabolical labyrinth, just a hut, which none could find unless Vecna wished them to. This was his sanctum, and it was also the place from whence, when he thought himself ready to conquer the source of all magic, Vecna ascended, forever leaving the world behind to dive deep into the mysterious astral sea. Centuries later, Dialia's wrath against the orcs gradually transformed Vecna's swamp into nothing but sand, but the dark energy of his ascension remained, leaving blighted sand which reduced his disused hut to nothing but the sinking half-frame of black-encrusted wood the party found. Probably something best left alone. I did forget an important, if perhaps obvious, detail about the encounter, though. Obviously, Draven took a sample of the black sand, once he was reasonably certain it wouldn't eat through his container. Way back when the Ataran civilization fell, the terminus was guarded and maintained by a number of constructs, as well as the 2 huge proto-Warforged fighters and 4 more humanoid, later model Warforged. MR8, a chunkier-bodied veteran of the Dead Wars, assigned to oversee the menial construct workers, AP-21, a specialist abjurer who helped implement and maintain the station's force field technology, CC-1, a specialist conjurer with many useful battlefield control abilities and the knowledge to help AP-21 protect against teleportation magic, and TR-4, a specialist transmuter whose spells, among other things, helped repair the constructs and other technology. Together they protected the place against random monsters, as well as the occasional attack by orcs, back before the Shadow War, when orcs were numerous and easily thwarted. TR4 told their story pretty thoroughly in the episode, how the Warforged all gradually died off, and in particular, they lost CC and his conjuring too early on. Conjuring is the school of magic associated with healing. Normally wizards don't get healing spells, but it seems that researching that school could have helped them to slow or prevent the long-term decay of their organic components. Without these abilities, AP-21 and TR-4 scrambled to find much more difficult solutions. Their research and TR-4's magic allowed them to keep up pretty well with the needs of their mechanical parts, but the organic situation became very dire. Now, TR-4 didn't even mention those two big Warforged lumberjack-looking things. Though technically Warforged, they were of the earliest generation, little different than true constructs, though apparently the difference was enough that they too broke down. But eventually, before AP-21 died, sadly too late to save the Abjurer, TR-4 solved a critical problem. He figured out how to interface his organic systems through those of the more primitive giant Warforged, and this breakthrough made it possible to start replacing some of his failing organic functions with the equivalents from the station's true constructs, the workers and digging machine. That ridiculous giant foot he grafted on actually serves as a kind of adapter between his organic parts and the construct parts, though the more functions he had to offload, the more inefficient and unwieldy his life support system became. It's less like Darth Vader's iron lung and more like hauling around a refrigerator-sized dialysis machine. In fact, the only reason he's able to haul it around at all is that the floor of the terminus is smooth enough, and even then only because he transmuted the treads right off that foot. He would treat most normal terrain as difficult terrain, and real difficult terrain like the sand dunes outside would be virtually impassable to him, though he could cast Fly in a pinch. We don't hear much more about that worker from the maintenance station that he was talking about, though. Was he really making extremely slow headway in nurturing its sentience? Or was he so lonely that he was seeing something that wasn't there? It's hard to tell. But there was a planned post-credits scene which would have shown TR-4 giving the worker maintenance instructions somehow, possibly a sending spell. Sanitize Sector B1, sanitize Sector B2, sanitize Sector B3, and sanitize Sector B5. Because you sanitized B4 before. Yeah, you're right. It was funnier in my head. And yes, I make that face every time I do TR-4's voice. I keep half my mouth clamped shut because his speech is impacted by that tube sticking out of it. I also close my eye on that side, though that probably does not affect the sound of it. I feel like I was really dancing the line for a long time, wanting to foreshadow Dell's true identity without giving it away. Looking back, it probably seems obvious in hindsight, but for all of you who may be kicking yourselves, relatively few people guessed it, or commented anyway. Daniel Durham and JR Movies 2007 guessed it when the name Dell came up the second time from Hag, but the earliest mention was a comment on episode 21, Helica, though a comment clearly posted after they fought Beta in 22. But yeah, way back then, Corvica posted, Dell. The next episode featured Beta. Delta? Delta? Son of a bitch! I didn't want to say anything at the time. I try not to comment on the accuracy of theories about the future, because if I start commenting on them, then it's spoilers, not spoilers, it messes everything up. But yeah, good call. The players had tossed out guesses that Dell might be a Dark Ancient at various points, like maybe even that early. Certainly by this episode, number 33, when the Orc's arrival at the Terminus provided more evidence for the theory. But I don't think they ever put the name together. Then again, they don't have the benefit of being able to rewatch episodes multiple times until I make them years after the fact. But yeah, for a long-ass time, there were rare appearances of my image of Dark Ancients in silhouette, where one of them was pretty obviously orc-shaped. I was worried that was too obvious, but I didn't leave much to connect that image to the name Dell. Berg's crew gave no reason to think Dell was a Dark Ancient, except the coincidence that a band of orcs was sent out aimed straight at Draven's family. Beta's appearance hinted the naming scheme, though with only one name to work from, it was a bit of a leap to make. When Dell came up a second time, in relation to Ataran artifacts, now I was expecting more people to make the connection, both with the players and with you guys. Looking back now, the glowing green eyes in his post-credit scene are a pretty clear connection to the scene of three Dark Ancients communicating in the beta episode. But when Dell finally arrived on the scene in this episode, it was go time. I figured I could hint as much as I wanted, because you'd find out by the end anyhow, and this way I could have some fun with it. So, while Dell still put on his orc act for the benefit of the warriors he had dragged along, his crappy-looking equipment was a little suspect, even if I didn't actually take the time to make his breastplate look all beat up like I was supposed to. Hitting as hard as he did without maneuvers suggested a very high strength, but an orc could easily have great strength. The fact is, the sword is totally for show. He's actually using his golem attack routine of 2 slams, plus an extra one from haste. He's skilled enough to use the sword without reducing his damage, so all it actually does is change one slam's damage type to slashing. But when Little One threw him, those were some tough die rolls. But I did make a point to describe him as heavy. His swift action Great Thunderclap is a replacement for the Stone Golem's slow ability. No way they could have guessed that. But my favorite bit is when Little One's attack deflects off his so-called armor. Verbally, I described how it deflected off his head, making only a slim cut, but the way I described it, it could have been interpreted as the effect of a magic armor class buff or something. The animation, though, with the blow glancing off his forehead, complete with spark, was what I really pictured happening at the time, and what I thought was a clear giveaway in the video. The first time I watched that spear blow with the spark, I laughed out loud for a good 30 seconds. It's not funny or anything, but just like, it was so perfect. Anyway, the Terminator gag post-credits was at best mediocre, but I didn't find the TR4 one I had planned very funny, as you've seen. And I figured that explaining what kind of golem he was, that is, an orc-shaped stone golem covered in a layer of flesh taken from corpses and transmuted to look realistic, replaced as needed, I figured explaining it would save a lot of speculation in the comments about whether he was a flesh golem or what, because I didn't see that particular question as being all that interesting. And also because a magical stone Terminator is cool. As always, I want to give a big thanks to all my generous Patreon patrons. If you've listened this far and want to support my channel directly, you can chip in at patreon.com/Demonac, and if you can't afford to, or just don't feel like it, remember, it doesn't cost you a dime to like and share Tales from My D&D campaign.